Hello, Sir John. Well, we at Creative Industry Summit, or me personally, couldn't be any happier having you with us today. In the last 3 years, every time we meet in Cannes Lions, and I always talk to you about coming to Egypt, and we always discuss it. But thankfully, the good side and the silver lining of the COVID-19 is that we are talking today in Creative Industry Summit. So yay, thank you for that.
Brilliant.
And what even makes it more special is that we are launching a new set of webisodes in Creative Industry Summit, and it's called the Creative Industry Summit Features. And what a great way to start with none other than yourself, Sir John Hegarty, the one and only. And the features are basically, they were created to bring to the table legends and gurus and people who have made big impact and change through their work. And It just worked out perfectly. You're our first feature.
Lovely. And here we are.
Your journey started in 1965. Yet I will jump to 73. And the first company you co-founded, which is TBWA London. You co-founded as a creative director. And 7 years later, the agency was the first to be voted by Campaign Magazine Agency of the Year in 1980. 2 years later, you jumped the gun and BBH came to life, which to be, I don't know if I ever told you that story, but I went in London, I found myself next to your office. So actually next to the black sheep, and I took a picture.
Oh, brilliant.
You're focused on a new passion. And every time we discussed you coming to creative industry, you mentioned that, which is the Garage Soho. It's an incredible project. Yep. And personally, how I see it, your drive and your passion for creativity is probably what made you decide to create that creativity hub or accelerator. Who is the one person you look up to and really inspired you in your journey?
Well, I've always, it's an interesting question, that, and people often ask this. I was never actually inspired by one person. I was inspired by ideas. Okay. I always found that people have a habit of letting you down. I don't mean that in any cynical way. I just mean it's the reality of life. They are wonderful at one thing and terrible at another. And, brilliant people can often be terrible people. Picasso was a horrible man, but produced brilliant art. So I always used to say, look at ideas, be influenced by ideas. They don't let you down. A great idea doesn't let you down. It keeps developing, keeps growing if you nurture it and look after it. So it was really ideas that inspired me. Of course, there were people like Bill Bernbach, who was, legendary in what he was doing. But, I tended not to. I looked at the work that was coming out of that agency in the mid-60s rather than the actual people doing it. And that, for me, was much more important.
Can you name one piece of work like the first Left to Mark?
Yeah, I suppose it really was that campaign for Volkswagen created in New York in the early 60s and through into the 70s. That sense of, it was the work that turned me into wanting to go into advertising, because I loved ideas. I loved just playing with ideas, even though I was studying graphic design at the time. But I found that I was sort of surrounded by people who were just worried about shades of blue, or should it go left or should it go right? And all those things are important. I kind of wanted to know, so what's the idea? What are we doing here? And they all looked at me as though I was mad. And so when I saw this work coming out of New York that was shown to me by a wonderful teacher, John Gillard, when I was at the London College of Printing, it was like a light bulb being switched on. It was smart, it was witty, it was clever. Also, it was encompassing. It didn't alienate, it didn't push you out, it brought you in. And I think the skill of brilliant advertising, as I think the skill of brilliant creativity, is to find a way of holding on to its integrity and yet bring everybody in, bring you into it. And that's advertising's great skill, because its job is to talk to as many people as it possibly can. Yeah. And that was the work really that turned me on. I thought it was brilliant, utterly brilliant.
Let me ask you, how would you define creativity? It's a very broad question, I know.
Well, it's very interesting. Yeah, no, it's all right. It's very. I've written quite a lot about this, but first of all, the thing to remember is that we are all creative. Everybody is creative. That's what separates us out from the animal kingdom or other life forms. You know, a dog doesn't get up in the morning and go, you know, how do I feel today? You know, do I like this sunshine? Do I like this sunrise? We do. We think about those things. So we're inherently creative. And somebody once said to me, so that's the first thing to remember. And somebody once said to me many, many years ago, you know, music is the greatest of all art forms. And I said, well, no, I think it's the second greatest of all art forms. I think life is the greatest of all art forms. So for me, creativity is an expression of self. It's you expressing yourself. And that's been fundamental to everything that I've done, the way I work. I believe in putting myself into the work. And, you know, if you listen and hear, you know, filmmakers or novelists or painters talking about their work, they so often say, I wanted to say this. And that's what you're doing. And I don't care if you're working in the commercial world, you're still saying what you want to say in the way that you want to say it, even though your brief is from a motor car company or people who make food or whatever it is. You're expressing it with your point of view. And I think, so for me, creativity is an expression of self, and that's very important.
What was the driving factor? Why did you decide that you wanted to study design or that you wanted to work in an agency? And your first experience in the first agency you joined, was it a turnoff, or was it like you decided, you know what, this is a challenge, I'm going to grow in this field? Or what was it like?
Well, first of all, I wanted to go. I went to art school and I wanted to be a painter. And I was rapidly informed that I wasn't going to be the next Picasso. But actually, you know, I quite liked having ideas and things like that. So a very, very smart and clever teacher said I should go and study graphic design, but not to do it I was at an art school called Hornsey College of Art, but to do it at the London College of Printing, which I went to study printing and graphic design. But I found that, you know, as I said earlier, that it was full of people who wanted to go back and be painters, and they were worried about shades of blue and, you know, which typeface to use and things like that. And I wanted to kind of, you know, talk about ideas, and it was ideas that intrigued me. So it was that sort of process of going from, you know, being wanting to be a painter to being a graphic designer, and then at design school realizing there was this wonderful thing called advertising. And the first job I had was at an agency called Benson and Bowles, which was a big American agency, no longer exists, in New York. And it was quite interesting because it was at a time when creativity wasn't on the pedestal that is on today. In those days, they talked about a creative department, but it was a very subservient department to management. And what happened is that, you know, a group of people like me came into the industry, and we were in a way the first creative people who wanted to be in advertising. We actually liked it. We saw the potential in it. Whereas a lot of people, you know, had been in it, were quite cynical, and they were novelists who had to earn some money, so they did a bit of copywriting, or they might have been painters who needed to earn a bit of money before they could go off and paint, so they were the art directors. But we actually wanted to be in it because we saw the potential to create great work. But of course, 1965, it was still very much an us and them situation in the agency with creativity and management. And it really wasn't until the 70s that creativity was beginning to be recognized as a power, a force for good, a force for success, a force for making brands kind of memorable and distinctive and standing out. And I always say there were two there are only two great advertising agencies in the world, as far as I'm concerned. One of them was Dorda and Bernbach in New York, because they created modern advertising. And the second was an agency called Collett Dickinson Pierce here in London, because what they did is that they took creativity to the masses, and they showed that actually it wasn't a minority interest, it was a mass interest. And if you did great creative work, memorable, distinctive, funny, smart, clever, involving and encompassing, that people responded. And that is the big change that happened in the 70s in the UK. And I was very lucky to be at the right place at the right time. And, you know, our careers all took off with the realization that creativity like that was very important. But those are the two great agencies, I think, that defined modern advertising. What
was a defining moment where creative bravery ruled, and what would you advise others regarding the point of having bravery? Because going back to your answers right now, I think part of the things that made you great and stand out is that you seeked what's different and you had that guts. So what's that one moment where creative bravery really ruled, and what's your advice?
Well, I throughout my career, I've had a number of them, but I suppose, you know, if I talk about BBH, you know, as opposed to the other agencies, I was a founding partner, by the way, in Saatchi & Saatchi in 1970, then TBWA in 1973. So I've done it 3 times. But I suppose at BBH, it was the launch of the Audi campaign, where we put the end line in German. And, you know, many people in the agency at that moment, and the debate was about how do we were doing all this creative work, how do we pull it together? What are we pulling it together with? What's the thing that's going to be continuous from one commercial, one print ad, one poster to another? And I said, well, you know, I was at the factory and I saw this slogan, an old slogan they had, Vorsprung der Technik. And I think we should bring that back and end all of our commercials with Vorsprung der Technik. And there was huge resistance, and I really had to fight it. And then I had a very good client at Audi who went, well, that's very interesting. Well, we'll do some research. The research came back and it said, no, don't do it. The British and Germans at that time, very, you know, tricky relationship and that. But I said, if we do it with a sense of humor and a wit, then it will be okay. Now, fortunately, history says, you know, this was the moment I had to stick to my guns. The client was great. And they said, well, we are a German brand. Why should we be ashamed of saying we're German? The other thing too, by the way, is in the UK, nobody quite realized Audi was a German car. They thought it was sort of from Belgium or somewhere like that, unlike Mercedes or Volkswagen, you know, very German sounding names. Audi, of course, is Latin. It means to hear. So people didn't realize it was a German car. So this underlined its Germanness, which was good. But of course, don't thrust it into people's faces. But in fact, we did. And it was a huge success. And it taught me that, you know, you have to be daring, you have to be different, you have to be brave in a way. But actually, the worst thing you can do is to be ordinary, is to be like everybody else. And I always say to all the creative people, you know, when they presented work to me when I was a creative director, I always used to say to them, you know, do you love it, what you're presenting? And if they said, yes, I love this. And I say, well, now you know at least one person in the world loves this. Now, let's hope more than one person loves it. But that's what, and that goes back to creativity as an expression of self. You have to believe in it. So that was a moment of bravery, but I had many others that came along, and you keep having to fight. You know, there's never, you know, that's it then, you've established your name, that's your reputation, there you are. And you realize, you know, if you look at other creative industries like music or something like that, or painting, artists have to constantly battle to have their point of view listened to and respected, constantly. And I always think that's a very interesting observation when they do documentaries on other creative professions, how even when they're big and famous, they have to go on, showing that being different and being daring is absolutely right. So there isn't ever one moment. It just keeps going in your career. You keep having to do it.
Yeah, I think the moment you settle down is the moment you start going down. All right.
Absolutely. You have to keep fighting that. I'm famous. I always talk about creativity isn't an occupation, it's a preoccupation. You're constantly doing it, constantly wanting change. And you just have to be engaged and excited by everything you see around you. You have to be excited by it. And that keeps you fresh. That keeps you, alive, alert, and interested in what's going on.
Can you tell us, in your own opinion, what do you think was were the reasons for BBH growing from an independent agency to a global one? And for a big while, you had a very few number of offices. You were very picky, I believe, because I was keeping a close eye. So you weren't really opening here and there, but you were very picky in your offices. I remember at the time there was like 6 offices, but your work was very global. All right.
Yeah.
So how can you grow an independent company to become that, and publicize how, when, why? Are you happy with that? Are you
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, that we realized the world was changing. Technology was making it easier for ideas to cross borders, and it was becoming more and more the case. And we realized that if we just stayed in London, that we wouldn't be servicing our clients. We wouldn't be able to give them the kind of service that they were going to need, and that agencies that had a global network would just take business from us. So in a way, we sort of thought we have to have a global presence. We didn't want to open, 120 offices around the world and, have them in every single town and all that sort of. How would the black sheep do it? And the black sheep would do it in a different way, because that's what the black sheep represents. It represents going against the grain. And we thought, why don't we just have offices in major commercial, cultural centers that are important, and we can run our business from that, and that we will appeal to clients where that's fine. They don't want you to be in every single major city in the world, and and the complication of running that. And so, like all those things, everybody expected us to go to New York first. And we thought, no, we'll go east first. And at the time, so this was about 95, 96, something like that, we thought about Hong Kong, but there was the big changeover happening. And we thought maybe not Hong Kong. So we thought Singapore, we'll go to Singapore. And we went to Singapore first, and learned a lot from that, learned how to begin to run it. What do you take from BBH to London? What don't you take? How do you let the local culture influence you? And it was out of that we did it. And then we went to New York in 99. So we went east first because everybody expected us to go west first. And then we went west afterwards. But it was an essential part of our plan to be able to offer a kind of global solution for certain clients. Not all clients want it, not everybody wanted it. And some clients wanted a completely different kind of global agency. And that's fine. We always used to say to people, we can't be all things to all people. We have to offer certain clients what we think is right. And that's one of the problems I think agencies have. They try to be all things to all people, and yet no brand can be all things to all people. It has to make a decision. Who are we going after? What do we believe in? And I always thought it was funny, and Nigel always used to say this, that agencies are supposed to be great brand advisors, but yet are appalling at handling their own brand. They're not very good at brands themselves. So that's what we did. We went to New York, and then we went to, we were for a period of time, we were in Tokyo. That didn't work out for a kind of 1,000 different reasons. Then we went to Mumbai, and we then went to Los Angeles, then South America to Sao Paulo. And so we grew what we thought were important. And obviously Shanghai, China, very, very important. So we went to China. So we grew a very select network to be different from other networks.
The entire idea, I believe, from day one was how to do it differently. So
how to do it differently, because if you're like everybody else, you become like everybody else. And then the whole thing with ownership became a problem because we needed a media partner to make this work. And so we sort of knew Leah Burnett quite well, and Nigel had worked there. And so we talked to Leah Burnett about, using Starcom, their media, global media network, who we had a high regard for and still do. And so we did a deal with Leah Burnett where they owned 49% of the company. We made them pay 100% for it, but they owned 49%, so we still had control. And as a way, because we didn't just want to give them the business, because that was giving it away. So we made them pay for it. And that worked very successfully. And then eventually they were bought by Publicis, and then eventually Publicis wanted to buy all of BBH. So that was a kind of process of how it worked.
But was it easy with the different cultures? And which was your favorite office in all of them? In terms
it was very difficult. I think it's always very hard when you take a very distinct creative culture from one country to another. Funny enough, the country that I think it was hardest in was America. And it's an interesting one, that, because I think we all feel that, Americans speak English, and, we watch American movies, and we have American TV, and, we think we know them, and we don't. And I think it's a very, very different culture. And I think I learned a lot about going to America. I thought one is, when you come from Europe, big isn't necessarily best. We've done big, we did big, we had a big empire, and the Romans had a big empire, and France had a big empire, and the Spanish had we did big, and it comes apart, it falls apart, So we were much more about being fleet of foot, tactical, quicker. You get to America and big is good.
Yeah.
Big is great. They have the Big Mac, the Big Whopper, they have big cars, and it's a big country, and, and big people, and, so you have to rethink big. And the other thing, interestingly, I found in America was that you'd be in a meeting and you'd think, God, this is going really well. This is really good. They're very enthusiastic. And I remember when I first, because I went I went to help open it, and I spent 2.5 years there, which I loved. I absolutely loved it. But I'd walk out of the meeting to start in the early days of being there, and I thought, wow, that really went well. That was fantastic. And my American companions would say, it was fairly average, John, that. I said, but why? They were eulogizing, this is great. And he said, no, John, that's America. Nobody says no. Nobody wants to be the group of people who turned down the Beatles.
Okay.
They there's a great story about the record label that turned down the Beatles, and they're obsessed by that, so they don't want to say no. Very Japanese like that. I found it very interesting, and that very, very status conscious in America again, which you think is odd because you think of it as a very egalitarian, very laid back, everybody wears a pair of chinos. No. It's a very, very formal country. And that's why your business card has to say senior vice president, VP, and it's got all these titles on it, which, for a European, you look at him, what the hell's all that? I don't understand it. But they're very, so it's not what you think. Not what you think. And that was the thing that we had to learn in America. Very, very different.
Interesting. Yeah. It's interesting because, yeah, you would expect to know it. And then all of a sudden.
Yeah. Well, the image is this land of the free. It's where anybody can be a president, where you can make it. You know, we don't have barriers. We don't that. No, it's don't you believe it? It's very, very structured. Oh, look at a business card. And that was it.
How do you find the balance between art that sells, something that you love and you want to do, versus art that is done for my own glory, which is the I, the we, and the ego again?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a very good question. And you know, I think here's a very brutal answer. You've either got the ability to create work that other people love, or you haven't. You know, it's like a painter. You know, why could Matisse paint pictures that other people loved? He didn't, you know, he didn't go to school. He didn't go to a special university. He just had that ability. So that's the first thing I think you've got to have. You've got to have that ability. Why does a songwriter write a song and it becomes a global hit and it has all? That's a skill. You can't teach it. You've either got it or you haven't. Like some people can dance, some people can sing, some people can add up numbers. We talk about that. Other people. So you've either got that. The other side of it is, I think you've got to have great partners around you who respect what you do and can be a guiding influence in always keeping you aware of what you're trying to do and how to make it even better. So yes, of course, I've had ideas, but I had two partners in John and Nigel who could be very honest with me. They knew where I was coming from, they knew what I believed in, and they could say to me, you know, John, I don't think this is as good as you think it is. And so therefore you step back and you try and do something else. And I think it's very, very tough for a creative person. I always say, you know, I did my little book on creativity, and in it I do a little chapter, and it says every McCartney needs a Lennon. And you know, I think when the Beatles were writing together or doing things but being together, they had a great influence on each other. When they went apart, they didn't have that anymore. And I think you lose your ability slightly. So I think a great business partner is very important. And you see it in music. You see it like, there's a wonderful book I always say everybody should read, and it's called Stoned. And it's written by a man called Andrew Loog Oldham, and he was the Rolling Stones' first manager. And it's a wonderful example how he helped manage this creative group, writing amazing music, or getting them to write amazing. First of all, they were singing and playing it, and getting them to write great music. And it's a very interesting, I think, tension there between a manager and the band, and you need that tension. It's a very good example of how you run a creative organization, because they're trying to write music that is going to sell. Like I'm trying to create advertising that's going to help sell a product. So you stay true to yourself, but you do need people around you who can say, nah, John, that's, and you've got to respect them. You know, so you've got to have that respect. And that's very important. And if you find that, then that can be wonderful. And that will then create a long-term relationship.
We couldn't help when we were looking at the Guardian's 3 Little Pigs advert, if we can go back a few years to this.
Yep.
We couldn't help but feel that it kind of related a little bit to COVID. You know, how during COVID, everybody was saying something today and then the opposite tomorrow, and people believing this and others believing that. And it just felt like it's a campaign that was created for something totally different and at a totally different time, yet resonated with today current issue. So How do you feel about that when people bring back some old work that you've done for something and tell you that it relates in a certain way today?
I think when you do work that has great integrity and it has a depth to it and a simplicity, but yet a depth to it, people can read lots of things into it. And the idea of the Three Little Pigs came out of how do you tell a news story, tell it from both sides, and then you can then make a judgment about how you feel about the news story. And what I want with a news story is I want to know what both sides are. I don't want to have just one point of view. So I think in a way, it was a very modern piece of communication. When you see the way the world has gone with fake news and people living in echo chambers and bubbles and not listening to somebody else. And it was saying, to really understand a story, you have to see it from both points of view. You have to get both sides. And what you want is a news publication that respects that and understands that. And so, taking something like the Three Little Pigs and turning it into a news story just seemed to us a very engaging and funny and thoughtful way of explaining what a newspaper does. And I think what happens is when you do something like that, it keeps resonating. It keeps resonating down through time, which is like, you can look at William Shakespeare and you can look at Romeo and Juliet, and it's about two houses who hate each other. And what hate creates, it creates great loss. Written in 15, whenever that was, but it resonates today because it's a truly profound piece of thinking about society, about understanding, about hatred, about how damaging that is, and about warring factions. And so even here we are, 500 years later, and that's still, which is why people go on performing it, because of the profundity of it. And I think that's what you're trying to do with great work, is to give it some sense of profundity, some fun, profundity, power, and then it will go on working.
I genuinely believe that a campaign like this can be used as an example for so many years to come on creating relatable work that would grow to be relatable throughout the years. So it's brilliant. And moving on to another brilliant piece of work, the Immortal Awards, Juror Bruno Bertilli named the amazing campaign, The Man Who Walked Around the World, as an immortal ad. And there's another place, which brings me to a different question. And I think you do believe that, but I'd like to hear your take on that. Do you believe ads can be used as an immortal form of art, like Shakespeare and the many greats?
Yeah, I do actually. I do think that. And certainly, a huge number of people today wouldn't agree with that. But just in the way that I think comic book art is viewed now in a different way as to when it was done. I think one of the great lessons of pop art, and I was a great fan of pop art and Andy Warhol and what they were doing. I think Andy Warhol was a kind of viewed, we called pop art, it was popular culture. And I think one of the great things that he was saying is that, when you look at those pictures of Marilyn and Chairman Mao and Elvis, what he was actually saying was that these are modern icons, because he came from a Catholic background. He was of Polish descent and you knew about icons and Jesus and all that sort of stuff. And he was saying, no, today, these are the modern icons. And so therefore he was taking a kind of an established art form, the icon, and he was translating it today. I think a lot of advertising does similar things. It takes issues. We've just talked about the Three Little Pigs, and it talks about how we relate to stories today. I think it has a sense of entertainment and engagement that I think actually, 50, 100, 200 years time, people will look back on and say, my God, I begin to understand what was going on there. And it's all done in 60 seconds. That's the genius. It's not done over, 2 hours, or, you've got to read 5 books. And I think that that sense of sexuality and awareness that we put into the Levi's ads was something that people can talk about. They will talk about how all of a sudden in the 80s, we began to look at the male figure as a kind of a sexual graphic image, just in the way, 1,000 years before the Greeks and the Romans had. We'd lost that.
Yeah.
The Greeks and the Romans did it, and then and then we lost it, and then we, in a sense, you can see how we brought it back, and then the male figure as a sort of sense of glory and kind of whatever. So I think it is only in time that you can judge things. But I do think great advertising will be sociologically important, because it will give people an understanding in a very different way from a book or an article or whatever it might be about what was going on in society at that time. Very powerful in that sense. And I think it will be, anthropologists will look back on it and go, wow, that's fascinating.
So for ambitious young people launching their careers and their startups, what advice would you give them so they can stand out?
Right. Well, the first thing to do is, why are you doing it? The second is, are you making a better product? And why is your product better? And, it's a very simple question. Why are you doing it? And is your product better? And if it isn't better, come up with a better product. And it's amazing how many people forget that. They forget, oh, well, it's pretty good and I want to do this. And you say, but there's somebody else who's doing it and they're doing it better than you. Is it better? And I think, I used to sit in so many advertising meetings with clients as the creative person, wishing to sell work. So I always used to have to stay listening to the conversation about business. And I'd hear them talk about, well, we're not doing very well in the Northeast, and, on-shelf display isn't very good. Maybe we've got to do an on-pack promotion. And I'd be sitting there thinking, you ever thought about making a better product? Why don't you just make a better product? And that's what I think. Is it a better product? And would you buy it? It's a very simple, they're very simple questions. So if you can ask those things and answer them honestly, then you have an opportunity.
Pretty intense advice.
Yep.
For that. Thank you so much, Sir John. It was an honor having you.
Well, my pleasure. My pleasure. And I just want to say to all your colleagues in Egypt, remember where you come from. Never lose where you come from. Never forget you have a distinctive culture. Put that into your work. Passion, belief, and energy will make the difference. So lovely talking to you all.
Same.
And have a great summit.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Maya.
Bye.
Yeah, lovely talking to you.
Same here. Thank you. Bye.